Welcome to Urbana Leader. My name is Julie McDaniel. I'm the Library Director at Urbana University. Anthony Ehresmann is away today campaigning for the state representative position. Our guest this morning is Shelley Pearsall, who is an author and former middle school teacher and still a historian. She worked at Hale Farm and Village. Trouble Don't Last was her first novel, and she has written several other historical novels, all aimed at middle schoolers. Trouble Don't Last won the 2003 Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction. Shelley's book, Trouble Don't Last, was also selected as a Choose to Read Ohio 2010 title. The State Library of Ohio is encouraging Ohioans to read books written by Ohioans. Urbana University, in partnership with Champaign County Library, Mechanicsburg Public Library, and the Champaign County Historical Society, wrote a grant to have county students read Trouble Don't Last, to host a series of programs about the Underground Railroad in Champaign County, and then to have Shelley visit the county to meet with students and adults. We're happy to have Shelley with us today on Urbana Leader to talk about Underground Railroad research and her book, Trouble Don't Last. So Shelley, how did you get started writing?
Well, actually, I got started very young. I was a first grader and had trouble sitting still in class. And my first grade teacher, when I would finish my work, came up with the idea that when I finished a worksheet, I was allowed to turn the paper over and draw pictures or write stories to her on the other side. And so that started my interest in writing. I'd race through my work in class and then create stories for my first grade teacher on the other side of the paper. And that's really how I got started. And she would pass the stories around the school, and other teachers would write comments back, and they were my first readers. And so I really have to thank my first grade teacher for inspiring my interest in writing.
And did you write about all sorts of subjects, or was it mostly historical things even at that time?
I was interested in history as a young person, although a lot of my very early stories are typical of what kids write about today, horses and pets and dogs and cats, and so a lot of animal stories, I think, because that's often what you read at that age. But I definitely also had an interest in writing about the early settlers and the pioneers. I was a big fan of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, and so a lot of the early things that I wrote have a Laura Ingalls Wilder tone to them.
And then Trouble Don't Last is about the Underground Railroad. How did you decide to write about the Underground Railroad?
Well, I had worked actually at a museum in Ohio called Hale Farm and Village, which is an outdoor living history museum. And during my work for that museum, I was asked to work on an Underground Railroad research project and put together a reenactment program related to the Underground Railroad. And as I did the research for that program, I realized that there really weren't a lot of books for young people about the Underground Railroad that really gave them a sense of what it was like to take that journey, the courage that it took, the obstacles that runaways faced. There were very few books that took the perspective of a runaway and talked about their experiences. And so that's really why I decided to tackle the topic. I think also I had a personal interest in journeys. I always loved reading about the Lewis and Clark expedition and the pioneers that went on the Oregon Trail, the men who went west for the gold rush. And so I've always personally loved the idea of the kind of person who takes a journey and what goes into that decision. So this was kind of a natural fit as well.
And so did you have any ancestors who were part of the Underground Railroad? Have you found any family connections?
As far as I know, I didn't have ancestors who participated in the Underground Railroad, although my great-great-grandfather was a member of one of the Ohio volunteer regiments in the Civil War. And just recently, putting all the dates and the pieces together, I realized that my own grandmother used to tell stories about going to the veterans' home to see him. And so I'm really not many generations removed from that particular part of American history, and it's fascinating to think that my own grandmother knew the man who fought in the Civil War from our family. So that was a fascinating discovery that I've only come to recently.
Mm-hmm. And so you did some specific research for Trouble Don't Last. I think you went to Kentucky and came back across the Ohio River. What was that like?
I loved the research for this particular novel. I wanted to be able to give a very realistic picture of the journey, and so I felt the only way to do that was to really see the exact places that the characters were going to see in the book. Now, obviously, some of those places have changed, but I did get a good sense of the landscape. So I did travel to every location in the story, starting in Kentucky, which is where the characters escaped from, northern Kentucky, traveling across the Ohio River through Ohio, and then around Lake Erie, and I ended up visiting a place in Canada called Chatham, where many runaways settled. So I really took the complete journey with the characters, although obviously I didn't have the transportation difficulties and the obstacles they faced in their journey. But I did get a wonderful sense of the landscape, especially the Ohio River area. I loved the experiences that I had on the river and imagining what it might have been like for a runaway to cross that river.
And so were you in a cornfield at night, the way Harrison and Samuel are?
I didn't stay in a cornfield at night, but I actually grew up in the city, so I didn't have a lot of experience with what it would be like to be in a cornfield at all during the day or the nighttime. And so I did find a cornfield in Ohio, some nameless farmer's cornfield, and I sat in it for about an hour, middle of the afternoon, and took notes about what it feels like to be in a cornfield, what it smells like. It smells like corn. The kind of green light that the sunlight reflecting on the leaves. So I'm glad I did that, because the characters in the story stay in a cornfield, and actually many runaways waited until the corn was tall before they escaped, because many of them hid in cornfields throughout their journey. It was a much safer place to stay than to stay in someone's home or to try to find a house with any type of secret room. Those were actually very rare. It was much more common for runaways to stay in barns and woodsheds and fields. So I had my own cornfield experience, just not at night.
For our photography project, we tried to take pictures that would sort of represent some of the things that you included in the book. And so our photographer went into a cornfield and laid down and tried taking pictures up through. And what we discovered now is that corn is planted so close together that it really wasn't, you couldn't see the sky the way Samuel describes in the book, seeing the sky. But the pictures are just, you described that green sunlight. It was really amazing. You just don't think about it being different.
They do plant corn much closer together, and it's much more uniform than they would have been able to plant it back then. So it is much more difficult to get in and out
That's right.
of the field.
I think in the book, Harrison describes that field as having been planted by a drunk donkey or
a horse,
drunk horse,
because the field is all crooked, and obviously today with the equipment that we have, the fields are very straight and very mathematical, but they wouldn't have had that kind of look 150 years ago.
Yeah, yep. And you were talking about the Ohio River and crossing that, and that's a really gripping part of your book. Would you mind reading us part of the River
Sure.
a Man chapter?
This is actually the scene. It's called Cornfield Bottoms, and right along the Ohio River, they had an area. There's an area of flat land, and they used to plant corn in some of those in that area, and it was called the Cornfield Bottoms. And so in this particular scene, Harrison and Samuel are actually on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, and they're trying to find the river. And one of the things I realized in the time that I spent in this area was that it would have been very difficult, in the dark, trying to locate this river that you didn't know how big it was. You didn't really know what you were looking for. There's lots of little creeks that feed off of the Ohio River, and so in this particular scene, they're still hunting for the Ohio River. Motioning for me to follow him, Harrison stood up and began to creep farther away from the fire. Softly he pushed the scratchy corn stalks aside with his hands, going down row after row, as if he was moving through deep water. Above the scratching of the corn rows, I heard far-off noises, a gunshot echoing, a woman's voice hollering, a dog barking, a cowbell. But near us, everything stayed still and empty, not a living soul around, it seemed like. The land had become flat as a tabletop, just as Harrison had said, and as we walked and crawled in the darkness, my feet pressed into clods of soft, damp-smelling earth. Mosquitoes buzzed in my ears. But I was listening so hard for the sound of white folks or dogs chasing us that I didn't notice the river until we were almost on top of it. Even then, I never heard the sound of it. The cornstalks just fell away to a rippling field of black and silver in front of us. Lord Almighty, Harrison said softly, sinking down to his knees on the grassy riverbank, we have found the River Jordan. and runaways called the Ohio River the River Jordan. And so, and that particular moment when they discover that river is a really important moment for all runaways, because once they cross that river, they're crossing from a slave state to a free state. And so it was such an important landmark that they named it after a biblical river, the River Jordan. So that's the scene when they're about to cross the river.
And then even though they crossed the river and Ohio was considered a free state, it really wasn't all that great of a place to be if you were an African American. And they were sort of surprised, I think, to see some of the discrimination that was
That they
going
face
on,
on
that they faced.
Yeah, and that was one of the challenges, I think, that Harrison and Samuel faced, because they did feel that once they crossed that river, they would be much safer, and the attitude of the people would be much different. And they really didn't find a lot of differences. One of the problems that runaways faced was that in 1850, after 1850, runaways could be pursued through any free state. So even though they'd crossed the river, the people who were hunting for Samuel and Harrison could certainly cross that river too and follow them. So it wasn't as safe as they were anticipating.
Mm-hmm. We did a program on campus about Ripley and called it Freedom's Gate, because it was the idea that it's the gate to freedom, but it's not freedom yet.
Yes.
They still had to make it to Canada or
Right.
somewhere else. How did you choose the title, Trouble Don't Last?
The title was a challenge. I think with each book that I've written, I really struggle with the title, because the title can either make a reader turn away from a book or interest the reader and they pull it off the shelf. So titles are a challenge. I had a number of different titles for this book, and I was about halfway through writing the story when I happened to hear the song. It's called Trouble Don't Last Always. It was a slave spiritual. Today, it's sometimes still sung in African American churches. It's a gospel hymn. But the earlier song was a spiritual, and I loved the line, "Trouble don't last always." It fit the character and the theme of trouble, and it was the perfect title. Unfortunately, my editor didn't really think that the title worked, and so it took some convincing to convince my editor and the publishing company to use it. They thought it was a little too wordy, and so we shortened it to Trouble Don't Last. But the actual spiritual and song is Trouble Don't Last Always, and sometimes I still forget and use that title for the story.
And in the acknowledgments, you thanked some young readers who had commented on the story as you were writing on it. What sorts of suggestions did they have?
The young readers who read the story in its early drafts were former students of mine, and I had one of the things that I wanted to do with the first book was make sure it was going to be a book that was compelling for young readers, and so I thought the best way to do that was to give them the book and give them the opportunity to comment. So these were students that I had taught in middle school. They agreed to read it in manuscript form, which is a tough form to read in, and then they made comments on parts that they might find confusing, parts that were unclear, parts that they loved and I should not make any changes to, especially the ending. I wanted comments from them on how to wrap up the story. And so they gave me very detailed comments. They were really wonderful readers, and I was able to make some changes to make it more clear to readers, and they also let me know what to keep my hands off of and leave in the story as it was written. So I have done that with each book I've written. I always try to pick out a few readers from the age group the book has been written for who are willing to read it and to give me comments on the story. So I'm very grateful to those readers, and I think they're in college now. But back then they were in middle school.
And so the things that they liked, have you found that those same stories have still resonated with other people as they've been reading the book?
Students are very insightful, and I think with each book that the scenes that the students have picked out as their favorite end up being the ones that I hear from readers are favorites as well.
And it's time for us to take a break. We'll be right back with more with Shelley Pearsall. Welcome back to Urbana Leader. We're here at the Swedenborg Memorial Library at Urbana University, and we have with us Shelley Pearsall, the author of Trouble Don't Last, which was a Choose to Read Ohio 2010 selection.